This is on? It's unmuted. It's on mute? Unmuted. Okay. Should be on. All right, thanks. Okay. Can everybody hear me? This is not on. Hello. Oh, there it is. Can everybody hear me? All right. No, you can't? Maybe we can turn up the microphone a little bit. So I'd like to welcome everybody today. This is wonderful. I love all the seats are filled. As a matter of fact, we have over 425 people represented today. I think that's awesome. Congratulations and thank you for being here. I'd also like to mention that we are being live streamed to our first floor because we couldn't get everybody in this classroom, as well as over to KU Medical Center and down to our expansion campus in Joplin, Missouri, the first new medical school in Missouri in 50 years. So congratulations on that. This is wonderful, and I can't wait to introduce Dr. Tweedy. He is the draw that brought everybody together. I'd like to also mention that this is our kickoff lecture in the 2017-2018 Current Issues in Bioethics series. This is our third annual series, and it's affiliated with the KCU Medical School curriculum. We're very proud of our bioethics curriculum, and we're humbled by the level of professionalism and mentorship that our bioethics community is bringing to our medical community. Before I introduce Dr. Tweedy, I'd also like to welcome a few people in the audience. Today we have some very special guests. We have about 20, I believe, 20 high school students from one of our pipeline programs affiliated with the Black Healthcare Coalition. We're very proud of you, and I hope to see you in our class in a couple of years. So keep plugging away. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Richard Payne. I think I saw him in the back. There you go. Thank you very much for being here, from Duke University, who also holds the John B. Francis Chair at the Center for Practical Bioethics, as well as Dr. Michael Weaver from our community, who is joining us. Dr. Weaver, thank you for being here. In addition, I'd like to also present today both the live audience and the streamed audience, that we have representatives from the Student National Medical Association from KCU, UMKC, and KUMC. So this is a very, very special time, and these students represent a diverse group of people currently in medical school, and we'll be meeting with Dr. Tweedy at 2:30 today with other members of the faculty here. What a great opportunity for IPE, interprofessional education, and an opportunity to learn. So welcome to all of you. Lastly, I'd like to thank Dr. Hahn, our president. I think he's moving around. Where'd he go? He was over here. Now he's over there. Dr. Hahn, thank you very much. The president of KCU, John Carney, I thought I saw him. I might not have. John Carney is the president and CEO of the Center for Practical Bioethics, our board of directors at the center, and the amazing faculty that I get to work with every day, as well as learn from every day. So thank you very much for being here. I'd like to move on to introducing and welcoming Dr. Damon Tweedy. He's our guest today. He's a best-selling author of Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflection on Race and Medicine. He was selected in 2015, his book, as a top 10 nonfiction book. That's not an easy task to do. He's a writer and lecturer and really talks about the intimate intersection between race and medicine. But as I was reading through his book, I realized it extends further than that. It's race, higher education, medicine, and all of healthcare. So we need to pay attention to this. He's published articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, as well as JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, and many others that I just couldn't list in my book right now. Dr. Tweedy is a graduate of Duke University. He did his residency in psychiatry at Duke Hospital, and he practices at the Durham VA Medical Center. So not only is he an author, but he's a practicing physician, so he has some street credibility when he's talking here. He truly knows what's going on. Dr. Tweedy is also a frequently requested lecturer, and some of his lectures, two that stood out to me, is there a black doctor in the house, talking about the small numbers of African Americans who go into the United States healthcare system, as well as Do the Right Thing, which really weaves a very engaging story on what is causing illness, death, and disability among black Americans. Dr. Tweedy is also a lawyer. Not too many people talk about that, but he can represent himself, so that's pretty good. He graduated there from Yale University, and I didn't know this, but I found out he was a Division I basketball player. Sorry, I looked up your statistics. You were actually pretty good. Let me say this, you were much better than me. Dr. Tweedy commented in an interview with the New York Times that learning to be a doctor was hard enough without me trying to change the whole system too. And although at that time he may have felt a bit intimidated by the hallowed halls and traditions and culture of higher education and medical education, he clearly has tapped into his experiences, both personal and professional, to no longer be intimidated, but rather to be an incredible force helping to change the face of medical education, as well as medical care. I think it's time. I think the United States' healthcare system needs this. This is a powerful book. He explores and describes and truly paints a picture of the challenges facing African Americans. More than just discussing the determinants of health, population health, he actually also describes how higher education and healthcare has a culture that directly influences the possibility of change, positively influences or negatively influences. And I think we're going to hear a bit about that today. Please welcome Dr. Damon Tweedy.
Yeah, thanks for that nice introduction. Yeah, don't actually look up my statistics. They're pretty bad. It's actually a pleasure. Yeah, thanks, everyone, for coming. I know some of you are probably here because you have to be, but and some of you want to be, but I'm thankful for all of you for coming. This is a nice lecture hall. You know, I'm thinking back as a first and second year student, the lecture hall I was in. It's one of those old places, like an old movie theater, gum on the floor, desks that were too short for me, rattling air conditioning. This is standard. This is high tech, so it's really nice. It's really a pleasure to be here. And so today we're going to talk about my kind of my journey in a way. And what I've done with this book is really two stories in one. The first narrative is really the larger stories about the African American community, the health problems, in some ways often very worse, in some ways unique, and really describing all of what goes into that and what's gone to it. But then the second part is the story of my own journey, going through that system as a black man, being trained in that medical world where I was seeing all of these problems taking place and trying to make sense of all of it. And so that's really kind of what the story's about. It's in many ways, there's a lot of references, there are a lot of statistics, but at its heart, it's really a narrative about the story. It's a story about people, a story about patients, a story about myself, navigating this world as a black man in a white coat. So that's really what my story and journey is about. It's funny, you know, I didn't actually preview the slides before I got here today. You know, I gave a lecture one time at a place and they got all the slides jumbled out of place. And so I'm going to just hope the folks here got it all set up. So far, so good. So two things here. So today, we're going to talk about three factors that contribute to health disparities within the African American population. That's the first sort of point. And the second one is this contrast between the black patient and black medical provider populations in various urban areas and rural across the U.S. And so there'll be a lot more data-driven stuff at that point. Here's a little context to sort of our discussion today. So this is a quote from Dr. King. I wasn't aware of it when I was in medical school. It was maybe some years later, as I was starting to think more about these issues, that I came across this quote. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. So this is 1966, kind of the end of what we consider in our country, the end of the sort of formal civil rights movement. And when you think about the civil rights movement and what it was about, you usually think about things like being able to go to the same schools or stay in the same hotels, drink from the same water fountain. Those are the kind of things that we typically think about when we think about civil rights. And so this idea about health and health inequality is not usually the first thing that comes to mind. And so it's really funny because when I started to write a book about my experiences, many people in the publishing world, they were still kind of thinking about race in that one sort of narrow dimension and not in this world of medicine. And actually, it was a really difficult sell for the publishing world to write a book about the world of health and the disparities and inequalities that exist in the healthcare system. But here's Dr. King, sort of the foremost figure when we're talking about the whole journey of civil rights in America, reflecting on it and talking about how health and the inequalities in health were the most dramatic of all. So for me, though, I certainly grew up in a world that was all African-American and knew about the inequalities in our society, but I was still also kind of trapped in that same sort of thinking about it in that way and not really thinking about it in the healthcare realm. And part of why I went to medical school was to kind of escape that. It was honestly to get in a world where everything I thought in my mind was objective. The heart's a heart, a lung's a lung, and I'm going to just operate and I'm going to fix it, and the race stuff can kind of be put aside. And that was sort of part of what attracted me to medicine to begin with. But when I got to medical school, I saw that I really couldn't escape that world, and that's a lot of what the story is about. So my journey began this is what Duke looks like now, so it's very similar. It was not like that when I was there as a med student. But I started med school at Duke in 1996, so 30 years after that quote we had from Dr. King. And what would happen during the first year of med school, like any med school, you learn about different diseases, high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, et cetera. And you learn about all the sort of ways it affects the body. But then the lectures would always sort of veer at the end towards what they call demographics. Who's affected more? Young versus old, men versus women. And the way the discussion would fold with race and ethnicity at the time in 1996 was always black versus white. Now we know that excludes at least a good quarter of our population, but that was the framework in which it was always presented, black versus white, black versus white. And when they talked about it, these are some of the things that we would see. So basically, it always felt like black people were coming out on the short end, no matter what they talked about. Higher infant mortality, lower life expectancy. High blood pressure and diabetes are sort of the seminal ones that are more prevalent in the African-American community, and they lead to all these other different problems that we talked about there below. So it was like no matter what they talked about, you'd always get to the end of the lecture, and they say that it was more common on black people, or that black people had a worse course when they had the disease. But there was never, so my first thought was why? But that was never brought up. It was always just sort of like a recitation of facts, but without any context to it. And all one was left to conclude was this: that being black is somehow bad for your health. But why? Again, it was like a risk factor, but there was no context to what that meant. So I'll be in a lecture like this. They come to that point of lecture, I look around and just kind of wonder, like, what are people thinking about that? How do they process this? Do they care? Is it just a fact to know and check off on a box for an exam and move on? Or do people care? And if they do, what do they think about it? Why? So there was something that clearly bothered me. But it also had a much more personal dimension than just that. So this is a picture of my maternal grandmother. And so she grew up in Southern Virginia in the 20s and 30s, the true era of Jim Crow, moved to Washington, D.C., worked as a housekeeper for both residential as well as some kind of commercial settings, and that was her life. And she raised 3 children, including my mom, as a single mother. Her husband, my grandfather, left the family when my mom was very young, and so it was just her and the 3 kids. And that was really the only grandparent that I knew growing up. And so growing up, I lived in Maryland. We'd go into D.C., which is where I was born, and we'd go to church on Sunday, and after church, we'd visit my grandmother. And my mom and her, they had this way of sort of talking and arguing kind of at the same time. And it was funny, they could like pick up a conversation that happened 10 years earlier, and it's like they just like picked it up like it just, I guess how families are. And so one thing they talked about a lot was her health. And my grandmother had high blood pressure, I knew that. And it seemed like she might be what you might call a challenging patient in some ways. She's pretty stubborn, maybe a little bit. And they go back and forth about taking medicines and following this sort of diet and this, that, and the other. I knew my grandmother had high blood pressure growing up, but in college it became something much more than that. So during my senior year of college, she had a stroke. And the first stroke was one that she was able to recover from, pretty mild. But then she had a subsequent stroke, and this one caused permanent physical and mental changes. She was never the same person at that point forward. And this was during my senior year of college. And during the summer before I started medical school, she developed heart failure. And that's ultimately what she died from during my first year of medical school. So about 6 weeks into my first year of medical school, my grandmother died. She was in her early 70s. And you think about the diseases she had: high blood pressure, stroke, heart failure. They're all more common among African Americans, and they have a worse course among African Americans. So that narrative in the classroom had a very personal dimension. Now that personal dimension became even closer to home here. So this is me, around the time circa first year medical school. I'm glad it's not a great quality picture because I searched long and hard for a picture of me in a happy face as a first year medical student, and this is the best I could come up with. So that's not very good, right? So there you go. So this is around that time as a first year medical student, and about 6 months after my grandmother died, we we're getting to learn sort of the intro to clinical medicine course, where you learn how to do vital signs. You measure each other's blood pressures and pulse, and you learn how to draw blood on one another. That's the sort of basic doctor-patient kind of stuff that you learn. And during one of these seminars, we were measuring blood pressures. The classmate measures mine. It's high. We're all novices, so she rechecks it, still high. Then she brings in the faculty supervisor, and he checks it, and it's really high. So you guys know the numbers. 140 over 90 above is considered elevated. You want it even lower than that, of course. So mine was about 160 over close to 100. So there's no question unequivocally high. So he suggests I go to the Student Health Center. Go there, a week or so later, make an appointment. And when you get there, you do the usual. You guys will learn this if you haven't already. You do blood tests and urine tests. Make sure there's not something else that you're missing as to why your blood pressure would be high. And what they found was some early signs of kidney problems. So I had protein in my urine. I had an elevated creatinine, for those of you who are doctors in the audience. And so kidney problems are a known complication of high blood pressure that is more common among African Americans, much more common. So I was 23 years old at that time in my life. Thought I was in great shape. I had just finished playing sports in college, even though I wasn't very good. I was thinking I was very physically vibrant, yet I was being told that I had this chronic disease that was more common among African Americans that had a worse course. So it became kind of a very personal sort of thing. So in some ways, solving these problems or figuring out what was going on was as much about addressing the larger problem as it was just about me sort of figuring out for myself and how to save my own self. So that was sort of the context in which I became intimate with these experiences. So as you go out into the world, in the clinical world of medicine, you start to see what's really going on. And again, I talked about how I thought that going to medicine would be a way to escape this reality, but in some ways it was just a reminder of how pervasive it is. One of the problems that I think we have in our society when we talk about issues around race, but many other things as well, is that there's this sort of either-or kind of perspective. It's as if more than one thing can't be true. And multiple things when you ask why, there are multiple factors. For each individual person, it may be one thing more than another, but all these factors are present in a large scale and they intersect. And this is a couple examples here. So this is talking about what we call social determinants, or system level factors in society. So the idea of health insurance, the reality of how health insurance impacts health. Black people are certainly less likely to have health insurance. If you have health insurance, more likely to be on public health insurance. And there's very real differences that can play out based on that. And so what I do in the book is not just talk about those things in abstract concepts, but to really put real faces on what this means. And so there's a couple stories I tell of going out to this clinic, which is about an hour east of our campus. And the thing about a place like a metropolitan area, you're in Raleigh and Durham and Chapel Hill, so this triangle, they call it, research triangle. And it's supposed to be, a lot of educated people that are more well-to-do. Then the further you get out of town, the further things change quickly. And it's almost like you're sort of going back in time the further you get out. So we went out about an hour east of campus. The town we were in was one of those towns that was all black and all white, very segregated. And the clinic, what you call a clinic, but basically it was like a one-room house. And we were there to sort of help people who didn't have health insurance in the town. So one-room house, patients there do not have health insurance. All the people we saw were black in this town. The town was half black, half white. And it was just striking to see the problems that people had that were very treatable, but couldn't be addressed in this setting because they didn't have health insurance. And so when someone says you don't have health insurance, so I grew up my parents didn't attend college, very sort of blue-collar background, but they had jobs, they had health insurance. And so I'd always equate this idea, if you had a job, you had health insurance. I had a very sort of naive look at it. And I didn't really get much education in this in med school at all. And so when you get to this clinic and you see these people all have jobs, but none of them have health insurance, like how is this working out? How can this be, kind of thing? That was sort of my sort of naive look at it. And I remember a woman there who had fibroids, which is a sort of non-cancerous, a non-malignant tumor on the uterus, caused bleeding and pain. She also had high blood pressure. two very treatable conditions, but no health insurance. And so I remember that the supervisor telling me, it was always struck with me, that he said, well, the only way she's going to really get treatment for these problems is if they get worse. And then she can get emergency care, and then we can go from there. So the idea that someone would have to have health deteriorate before they could get treatment for a problem that was preventable never really, it just doesn't make sense. And so I really struggle with seeing that reality. And there's so many aspects of how just so this idea of living in different worlds and different spaces leads to several other factors that then in turn impact health, whether we go to different schools, different types of food exposures, trauma, violence, all those things are there. So it's much about class and the way class and race intersect. And so that's a really big part of what I saw as I went out on my journey. I'm in psychiatry, and so in some ways the problems are worse in the mental health field. Black people are less likely to get treatment for comparable mental health problems, and when they do get treatment, it's much more likely to be in the setting of emergency rooms, inpatient hospitals, being involuntarily committed against their will. So quick story, as a young resident in psychiatry, one night I was in the ER, and there were two patients that came in back to back. Both had very similar problems. Two young women in their mid-20s. A breakup had happened in their relationship, and they were not dealing with that well. And so they were really struggling with it. And they both were thinking about and hurting themselves in some way. So that's a common thing you see in psychiatry. And so both of them needed to come into our hospital, but the first person was able to come in because she had health insurance. In this case, she was white, had health insurance, was able to come in. Nobody wants to be in a psych hospital, but if you're going to be in one, it's the kind of one you want to be in because you have your own room and you have individual care, someone sees you every day kind of thing. The other woman didn't have health insurance, couldn't come to our unit. You try and call around to other hospitals, and they won't take her because she doesn't have insurance, and so she has to go to the state hospital. Now, the state hospital serves a real function for people who are violent and very, very severely ill. Not an ideal place for a young woman who's sort of on the relatively milder end of serious illness. Nonetheless, that's the only way she could go. And so we had to actually, and then the problem is that when you go to a state hospital, from one hospital to another, you have to be taken by police because you can't just go by the regular sort of venue. So this person had never seen a mental health doctor in her life. First time she sees one for a crisis, she has to go by way of police car. And then you go by way of police car, that means you get changed into your police garb, and you have to be handcuffed and put in a squad car. So imagine that being your first experience encountering the mental health care system when you're in a crisis, and how that may impact your future perspective. Like if you have a problem down the road, are you going to come back? Are you worried about that happening to you again? In this case, this woman was black, did not have health insurance. So again, it was another example of how this class and race lines sort of intertwined and resulted in really different care. Very different care for people. So it was just a really striking source of illustrations that you would see. Or these are things that the individual doctor can't control. These are system level factors that are impacting the world of health. There's also the world of the doctor and the patient and how we interact with one another and how we interact with our patients. And this is also an important thing to consider. I think it's, again, we get into this issue about blame, but I think in modern times, it's a bidirectional sort of thing. So historically, there's been a lot of bad things that have occurred to African Americans in the healthcare system. I'm sure that you'll learn about some of those in the bioethics seminar. There are many things. There's something called a Tuskegee experiment. There are many, many other things. That's just one tip of the iceberg sort of thing. Many things that have occurred. And what that's created is a cultural kind of memory or mindset, if you will, of often being sort of mistrustful of the healthcare system because of a history that's evolved. And so I would often be put in a place as a doctor, a young student, of being almost like a person who would translate to the other patient. Like you have a black patient there who's questioning the care that they're receiving, I'll be brought in to sort of assure them that this was the appropriate care being delivered because there's this long history of mistrust that had occurred. And unless you think this is something that can't happen now, I had an experience in myself as a young doctor being a patient. Now, before I tell this story, some people may take issue because you could say that it's a class issue versus a race issue. I think the important point is that this is how people can be perceived differently and how that then can turn impact their care. So I had an old knee injury from playing basketball, and one day I was working in the yard and re-injured it. It was already been re-injured early, but it sort of was reactivating even worse. So I knew I needed to get it checked out. So I went into the clinic, and it's like an urgent care clinic. It wasn't a particularly busy day. Got checked in by the nurse. It was very nice. The doctor comes in. He sees that I have knee pain, and he doesn't, never looks at me. He doesn't examine me. He just sort of says, well, he sees me sitting down and says, well, knee pain. Can you just stand up? Can you sit down? And then that's basically the end of the evaluation. He sees that I can stand up and sit down and can halfway walk, but he doesn't know anything about what kind of job I have or how knee pain might impact. It's just nothing about me as a person, and it's going to usher me out. So at this point, I'm a doctor. I know a little bit about how evaluations might go. And so I say, this seems like maybe I should say a little something here. So I use some kind of vague sounding medical terms to sort of signal that I might know a little bit about what's going on. And eventually he gets around to learning that I'm a doctor. And you can imagine, so I was working in the yard. So I came to the clinic not dressed like this. I was in the sweatpants, tennis shoes, beat up tennis shoes actually, old shirt. Didn't think about that when I walked in. Maybe I should have, but didn't think about that. Went in, and so got treated one way. And then once he learns I'm a doctor, the entire counter changes in ways that were just striking to me. It was suddenly as if, suddenly he first that was, well, he did a physical exam, a real one, like, put me through the different range of motions. I get an x-ray, and suddenly it's like, well, you need medicines, you need crutches. It's like, wow, it was like it's being two different people and getting two different levels of care. It was a striking illustration of how you could be presented in that way. So this has happened 10 years ago. It's just, and so it's not to bash doctors. I'm a doctor. I know how hard medicine can be and how quickly. So that's not the intent of my story. Stories is about how people can be perceived so quickly and make judgments about people, and how that in turn can impact the care they receive. And so that was a really striking kind of illustration that I experienced. There's this third piece here that's a really important piece to the puzzle about why the health differences we have. I told you guys that I had high blood pressure diagnosed as a med student. So there's a term, I almost think of this as diet in a way as diet as a form of identity, if you think about it. So I grew up in a community that was all African American, kind of lower income spectrum, Southern sort of tradition. You can imagine probably what my preferences might have been looking there, kind of growing up. And it wasn't just that. I mean, that's not necessarily, for me, it was also about the volume of what I ate. So you imagine, so I would always look at weight as the barometer of being healthy. And so I was always on the thinner side. And so I'm okay, right? I'm good. It doesn't matter that I'm eating a whole pizza in one sitting without coming up for air, or 12 biscuits at Bojangles without coming up for air, or 6 hot dogs and 3 hamburgers to wash them down. And I would do this is all just totally, I would do like this. So I would go to Subway and get 2-foot-long subs. And so this is kind of how I ate. And so when we were in our joke in med school, we were like, man, we had the cleanest kitchen in the world because we never cooked once. Like, we'd always eat out every single meal. But even though I was seemingly healthy on the outside, it was just clearly impacting my health. And as you learn in med school more about how, you don't learn a lot about it, but you learn some about how nutrition can impact your health, and particularly blood pressure. I started to try and make some changes, and I did for a little bit, but it was really hard. And it was harder than just the idea about behavior change being hard. That's for everybody. It was a sort of a obstacle or a barrier was getting in the way. And it was always, and so if you looked at the diet on the left with the salad and the grilled chicken and whatnot, I had begun to associate certain foods with a certain culture and certain way of living. And so someone who has a salads and low-fat yogurt and bottled water and all that kind of stuff, that was sort of like again, I grew up in a community that was all African-American. That was sort of like a different way of eating, and that's not my way, right? That's like I kind of identify that with like a upper middle class white sort of way of eating. And here's the thing. So going to a place like where it may seem silly to you, but you come from an environment like I do, you have to give up a lot of yourself to thrive in a place like that. Get a place where I come from, to get to a place like Duke, there's a lot you got to give up about yourself. And there's a lot of sort of difficult psychological things you got to adjust to. And so diet was one thing I just really had a hard time adapting to, because I felt like this was yet another thing I was going to have to sort of give up in some way of my past. It took a long time to sort of come to peace with that. I actually had a patient who was a guy who was pretty not that well off in terms of socioeconomically, but we had a long discussion about this one day, and he really it was kind of really heart to heart. It's about how I could learn from a patient, and he really helped me sort of put all this in context, because I saw him making changes, and I'm thinking, man, if he can do this, and he's got a lot of serious problems that I don't have, maybe I can really do something with this as well. And so I took some blood pressure medicines for several years actually, but for the last, say, 10 years or so, I've had, just through diet, and it's not like I'm just some stickler, I don't want to insult anybody, but I'm not like I don't eat perfectly, let's put it that way. But maybe 80% of the time, 75% of the time, I eat like that on the left, and maybe leave some room for the other stuff on 25% of the time. And I've had maybe have a normal blood pressure for the last 10 years. So I went from having 160 over 100 blood pressures to like 120 over 70, 120 over 80. And it's just been through kind of being able to kind of process those changes. But it was more than just sort of, it was a psychological thing that I had to overcome to get to that place. And so that's a really complicated thing. A lot of times when doctors see patients, I don't know if they're always mindful of that kind of thing. Patients are often too quick to be labeled as non-compliant, or those sort of things, but not really understanding what is the context in which people are dealing with issues and struggling to make changes. So always think about those things as you move forward and see patients. It's a really important piece of the puzzle. So that's the whole issue of sort of disparities and that sort of thing. But there's another piece of the puzzle, which is this idea of sort of navigating that world as a black man in a white coat, if you will. And I characterize these here as the good, the bad, and the awkward. So initially, I didn't really want to write about this piece when I was writing the story. I really wanted to focus just on the patients. I'm really not someone who likes to. It doesn't sound like it now here in the room, in front of 400 people talking about my life. I'm not really someone that's not really my sort of inclination or nature to do that. But as the story became, as I started writing the book more, I realized that was the only way it could really be an authentic story. Is if I sort of told you what my perspective was on these issues and how I saw them and how that informed everything else. So the good, the bad, and the awkward. So the good is, a lot of times many patients in Durham, North Carolina, which is 50% African American, had never seen at Duke, never seen an African American doctor. They'd have a lot of sense of pride about that. You'd often see some older white patients who I guess who in some ways had been involved with the civil rights kind of journey, who sort of saw a sense of pride and maybe some of the efforts that they did also was bearing fruit in sort of seeing me in this role. So there's a lot of those kind of interactions. But there are a lot of interactions that weren't so great. And so I'd characterize those as the bad. As a first-year med student, a lot happened in that first year. As a first-year med student, I remember being in a lecture hall and going out, and the book opens with this scene, where I go out into the lecture hall for a break between classes, and I come back in, and the lecturer literally kind of comes from the podium up to the front and confronts me, and he says, well, are you here to fix the lights in the room? And, you look, first you're thinking he's talking to someone else, and I was actually not looking for race to be the first thing. I'm looking for other explanations. Am I dressed differently? Is it something, did I shave? Anything I would think of other than that. I was trying to think of, so I was trying to in some way putting the blame on myself in some way, which is kind of messed up if you think about it. But that was sort of how I was looking at it. And then we get back and forth, and eventually he says, well, I told him I'm not in here for that reason. He says, well, then why are you in my class? Like I didn't belong if I weren't there for that other purpose. And so I was struggling with the idea of whether I belonged to Duke myself. I was like, was this all like, am I here as like a token? I'm struggling with all those kind of thoughts myself. And here's a guy saying I don't belong. And I was like, man, maybe I don't belong. It's not just anybody who's a professor. It's a guy who's sort of controlling your grades and everything. It wasn't just a random person saying these sort of things to you. So for me, it became a defining moment in my journey because either I was going to fail out or I was going to, succeed. And so I studied literally for the next several weeks. I mean, I slept 2-3 hours a night for 3-4 weeks on end. I mean, literally, no exaggeration. And I ended up getting one of the highest grades in the class. And at the end of that course, you would meet with the professor to sort of process out. And that last interaction was also awkward because he kind of had this memory of we all knew what had happened before and it was awkward. But then he saw how well I'd done, and he was like in total disbelief, complete disbelief. And he kept like checking the name and the badge and trying to found I can't be so. And it was really awkward. And it was like you feel good that you've achieved, but it's also a reminder that no matter how much I want to just fit in like everyone else, people are always going to see me in some different way. And I had to learn how to deal with that. And so that was a lot of kind of the lesson of that story. But I did persevere. But that was a real sort of defining point in my journey in that way. Just one quick other thing. The awkward is sort of one other quick bad statement story was as a brand new intern. One night I was at the hospital, again, the only black doctor. This was a common theme. And a patient, go down to the ER to admit a patient, and the nurse says, watch out for this patient. Normally that means the patients might be violent, potentially, or aggressive, or something you need to just be careful about. She said, no, he doesn't want to see an N-word doctor. He used the word, of course. And again, it's this idea of just wanting to fit in, but realizing you're different. And so I go in there, and then his daughter has a shirt with blazing with the Confederate flag. And we're in North Carolina, so it's not like something you've never seen before, but it was like, okay, here's that. And then in another family member had a tattooed Confederate flag. I'm thinking, man, this is not going to work out. This is going to be a bad setup. Because they had responses to me that were negative, and I had responses to them that were negative. But one of the lessons was about perseverance. There was a sense of me that wanted to just kind of escape and just say, let someone else deal with that problem. It's not my problem. But I didn't have a choice, and this guy ended up being really sick. And amazingly, although the story it certainly wasn't a perfect ending, at the end, this guy ended up having a terminal illness, and his family ended up, in some ways, embracing me at the end. It was an amazing thing to sort of see how he could go from just the extremes I mean, that's the extremes in one end, and sort of being able to make some significant inroads in that. And so certainly they would never have had me over for for their dinner, if you will. But nonetheless, we were able to sort of make a sense of respect that I'd done what I could for their dad. And we'd done the best we could, and I'd worked long and hard to do the best for him. There was a certain sense of like, man, maybe there's some hope in this sort of sea of complete differences. So that was sort of the story there. The sense of awkwardness is idea. You look at me here. You see me so when someone sees a used to be 6'6" black man, the last thing you're usually thinking about is someone who's a doctor. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, most people are going to probably say no. I can tell you there's never been a day in my life, and I really believe it, this is honest God truth, where someone has not asked me about basketball, playing basketball. I mean, it's not a day in my life where I've ever met where I've gone out in the world and met people I haven't met before. Literally not a single day. So, man, if I had just had a nickel for every time, I would be so rich. If it was nickel, so I was in the airport today, and it's always comes up, right? And so that's sort of and so, you expect it, it's the reality. You look on TV and, most of the professional players are black. So it's not like, I understand why it is. But the flip side of it is this idea that somehow because you're tall and African-American and you can't be anything else, and you should only do that. And if you do something else, then there's something wrong with you. And sometimes patients would kind of intimate that. Like, well, what are you doing here? Why do you, and there was one case of an older woman, her husband was the patient, and she was so flabbergasted and worried about me. I'm so worried about you. How can you take care of her husband and play all your games? Aren't you going to miss your game? Like I was here as a medical student, doctor. She thinks that I'm just like masquerading as Clark Kent, I guess, as the, and I'm really the basketball superhero. There's that kind of like story, right? So there's constant stories like that. And then there's also the sense of awkwardness. I've had several scenarios where people will come in, and particularly when I was younger, there's this sense of threat. So I'd come into an exam room and people would be wary of me, not just like displeased, but like, please don't close the door. Like, I'm gonna have a white coat on, I'm a doctor, I have a name tag on, what am I gonna do to you, right? But there's that overwhelming sense of threat as well. So there's just so many interactions, again, where no matter how I saw myself, people would see me in their own way, and I had to deal with that. This is a sort of pick up on that same theme. It's this idea about navigating these two worlds of the black and the white, if you will. And many of the patients that I would see would be very similar in their background to people in my own family. This guy reminds me of my uncle, my cousin, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd become part of this medical world that was largely white and Asian, and in some ways that had changed me, and I was trying to navigate those two worlds and not sure where I fit in. And some part of me, so it's like I had allegiance in both worlds, but I describe it as having a foot in both worlds, but not having 2 feet in either world, and it was sort of a constant sense of that as I was going through my training. This is interesting, some interesting data you guys may not be familiar with. So this is a report from the AAMC, came out a couple years ago, right when my book came out, actually. And it looked at the number of African-American men in medical school, and as you can see there, between 1978 and 2014, you sort of more or less flatline. Now, during that same period of time, the black female enrollment is nearly double. So back in the late 70s, black men outnumbered black women like 2 to 1 in med school because of the society, because often historically women were much less likely to go into medicine for many reasons. But now we've had this thing interesting where black women now, you'll see the flip where it's like 2 to 1 in favor of black women. I've gone to many med schools where it's even much more dramatic than that. You go to school and there'll be 5 or 6 women for every African-American male. So it's a really striking thing that you see. So that just furthers the sort of way in which I'm seen as different. But look at, also during the same period, the black population in this country has increased by 10 million, and the population of doctors is doubled. So as this number at the top has sort of been flatlined, the physician population has gone up from around 400 to 800,000. So you can see that means the proportion of African-American male doctors has gone down considerably. For those of you interested, there's a lot of data, and it's hard to parse some of it out, but for those of you interested more, you can find the report right there, that link that I had there. But it's just an interesting set of data, and so this furthers the sense of alienation in some ways that I often will feel. This is some other data. So this is looking at the U.S. population, 13%, but among practicing doctors, less than 4%. Mental health, some in psychiatry, the numbers are quite low. We think about mental health and how important in that setting, the relationship between the provider and the client, patient, if you will, is even maybe more so important than maybe, say, for someone taking care of like a broken finger. Not to minimize that, but how even more important it could be in that setting and how complicated that can be. So during my training, I was the only black doctor in my clinic. The clinic served half the patients we served were African American. And I remember that first few weeks that I was there, my phone just went off the hook because people were like, Damon, we have this patient we want you to see. Damon, there's a patient who wants to see you. Damon. So it was like me, I'm one person, just trying to learn the ropes like everyone else, but then being constantly reminded that I'm different. because it's all. So I ended up having a caseload that was like double everyone else's. And so again, so it's just because of this reality of patients, the providers not being able there to meet the demand of the patient. So if you think about it from sort of an economic model, that kind of model, supply and demand model, there was a real problem there. This is looking at some of them. I told you the U.S. population of African Americans was 13%, but you can see in many of the cities. Sorry, this does reveal. I'm from Washington D.C., Maryland. I lived in the East Coast my whole life. It may reveal like an East Coast bias, so don't beat me over the head for that. Sorry. I did put St. Louis and Chicago. You can see how much higher the numbers are among African American populations in these cities. So you have schools. Many major schools are in these cities with large black populations with very few African American providers, and there's often been this tension between the communities and these hospitals and medical schools, and so that's the dynamic in which I was thrust as a medical student. So it gives you a kind of a visual. I think in Kansas City it's about what 30% African American. Is that about right? Something like that, I think. So no one's challenging me, so I guess I'm somewhere in the right ballpark. So I laid out a lot of problems, obviously, but so where do we go from here? How do we sort of begin to address these issues that we talked about? And we're talking here about healthcare reform being one, certainly a necessary but not sufficient piece to the puzzle. My take on this is that there are things in life that should certainly be political, but healthcare is one that it's really sad that it's gotten to a place, it's been that way for a long time, that it is that way because these interests affect everybody. And so when you're a psychiatrist, people tell you about everything, including their political beliefs. And so you see patients of all stripes and illnesses does not, specific to any particular orientation of political beliefs. And so everyone has a stake in this game, and everyone gets it suffers in a way. And anytime we have a system, we continue to have systems that depend on one party versus another party being in place to enact change, we're always going to sort of fall short. And so that's unfortunately where we continue to be. And but that does not mean that there aren't things that we can't do on a smaller level. So that'll go to the next slide. So you as doctors and patients, no matter what's happening in the outside world, you have a tremendous ability to impact the people that are in front of you and see you. And this is part of what drew me, even though I'm interested in the big issues, that really still has kept me into the world of clinical medicine, because I really enjoy the one-on-one kind of connections you can make. And you really can help people's lives in many really significant ways. And we don't live in a world that's going to be perfect. And I don't think the goal should necessarily be that you should always see someone who looks just like you. I don't think that's even necessarily the goal. I think there's a lot of growth that can happen when you see people who are different than you. And it's a story that I tell at the end of the book of seeing a guy who was a white guy who was maybe 7 or 8 years younger than me. He'd been in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was really having a hard time with adjusting to the life back here in the States, in the U.S. And at first, I was looking through his chart because he had seen another doctor who was kind of similar to him. And I remember sort of looking at this guy's chart and making sort of judgments about him that weren't, I saw that he liked certain things that I didn't like, and maybe associate with a person in a certain demographic, And so we all make these. You realize we all make these kind of judgments about people without even necessarily realizing we're making them. And I found myself doing that as I saw this guy. I walk in the room, and the guy's like, "Man, you got to be kidding me! You can't be my doctor," sort of thing. That was his reaction. And so I'm asking, which is not uncommon. So I'm asking a couple questions, really short questions, really short answers. Short question, short answer. So I'm thinking, this guy's never going to see me. I probably don't want to see him. Let's move on. But I decided, I can do better than this. Let me ask him more. So I started asking about his family, and he gave some small details about how he and his dad like to shoot pool on the weekends. Really small, trivial in some ways detail. But it was a really important detail for me because it was something I could connect to because I had done the same with my dad growing up. It was a real connecting point. It was the first time I could see him as somebody more than just a series of stereotypes about, this white guy who likes to, shoot guns and hunt. And it was all these sort of stereotypes that they have. And it was like the first time I could see him as someone more than just that. And so I told him that and about, my dad playing pool. And you could see the reaction in his eyes as well. And it was like that was the beginning of us making a connection. And so for the next several years, he came back, he saw me. At first, he was really struggling. He was on medications, but he was able to sort of eventually wean off the medications. He went back to college. He got engaged. He got married, had kids, and got a good job. And so I was able to follow him and help him through his journey and transition into the world. And so I think about that as a lesson that all of us can sort of take as we move forward and we start to see patients. We live in a world where people will be different than us, but there's always ways that we can find ways to connect with people, even the people who seem very different. And so always finding that moment and trying and constantly striving for that is a really important piece when you see patients. So that's that. We all clearly have to continue to work at the level of finding a way for to mitigate the impact of certain communities that people are raised in. and how that impacts their health, and how can we get people who are in these communities to get more of the benefits of there. So that's a goal for those of you in the world of public health and policy. That's a real serious issue and a real continuing challenge to the problem. This is an interesting slide. This is something new I wanted to just talk about. There's also this idea of changing the narrative about what it means to be a black man in particular here. So you see on the right, Cam Newton, LeBron James. I love sports. It's very integral to my life. I played sports, high school, college, love sports. But when you think about the outside impact it has, so in the world I grew up in, if you were a black guy, really the only way to get out of that community and go to college was to be a basketball player, football player, track, baseball, something like that. Just otherwise didn't happen. My brother was like the older brother was the first person in the neighborhood to sort of get out of that sort of mode, and that was a tremendous impact on me to sort of have that in my own home, that someone could just go to college and be a regular person. Even though I didn't end up playing basketball, it was still the idea that I could just be a regular person in college, and that was a huge deal that many people take for granted, but it was such a real thing. And so I'm not in any way trying to diminish the impact of those guys and what they do, and I have a lot of respect for them. My issue is that there's a sense in society that's the only sense of success for an African-American man. When you look at the numbers, even though I said there are only 2,000 black men in medical school, which is pretty low, it's still the same as the number of men there playing NFL and NBA. When you think about how outsized the attention is to people like that, right? Versus the almost invisible nature of people that are in the world that we live in. And so I think it's really about this idea, why are black men so underrepresented even compared to black women? And I think this whole idea about narrative and what it means to be an African-American man is really a big part of that story. So I'd like to try and change that in some small way. A final thought, this is really the last slide, is this idea about, again, you live in a world where the things may not be what you, and it's been this way, not just now, but for a long time, things are happening externally that you can't control that impact health. But what can you do just in the grand scheme of life? And so this is another quote from Dr. King that I like, where he says that if I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. So think about your own lives. You may be medical students. You may think that you can't do anything. You can't impact people's lives at this point. I would challenge you otherwise. Imagine me as a 8th grader in a school that was 98% African-American, low-performing school. Many kids wouldn't graduate from high school, let alone go to college. But I had a good thing for numbers, so I did well on the math test. And an 8th grade teacher, who's a white woman, 40s. A lot of teachers in those settings, they may mean well, but a lot of times students kind of get pushed through, and it's just the way things work. But this teacher sort of said, no, I want you to take a test to get into this magnet program. And my first reaction, being from the community I grew up in, was that no, I'm going to be out of place. No one in my community's been there. The kids there are going to be all different than me. I'm not going to fit in. That was my initial take on that. She persisted. She eventually called my mom at home, and they ended up taking me to a testing site, dragging me, if you will. And I ended up taking this exam, thinking still nothing's going to come of it. Found out about a month later that I get into this Science and Tech Magnet program. And so I still didn't want to go. But eventually I did. My mom said I had no choice. Sometimes that's what moms do. And when I got in there, that was the first point in my life where I was 14 years old, where I could sort of see a different vision of my relationship to the rest of the world. Like, if you would have asked me as a 14-year-old, could I have been a doctor, or could I have been anything, it wouldn't even been conceivable. It would never have been something I possibly could have thought would be possible for me at all. Just not even on the radar at all. And so it was the first point in which I could begin to see that maybe I could do something else in this world. And because I knew I wasn't a great basketball player, and I wasn't going to be able to make that living doing that. So, but I had no sense of what else I could do. And that's the kind of world that I grew up in. And so this teacher did a really small thing in the grand scheme of life, but she was really able to transform my life in a tremendous way. I've never been in the place I'm at now had I not had that experience in that program. So I challenge you guys as you go out in the world, think about the ways that you can make a difference in people's lives in that way. As medical students and later as doctors, it's tremendous. And never lose sight of that no matter what else is happening in the world. So I wanted to kind of really leave you with that thought. And with that, this is my final information. The publisher has sort of made me do social media. I'm really not someone who's natural at it, but what I do enjoy most is the feedback that I've gotten from people over the time that I've had the book out. People, I expected to get feedback from African-American students, and many, which is what I would anticipate, but it's gotten a lot more traction from people. In some ways, the book speaks to people in a broader sense. It talks about this idea of being different, and how do you process that, and how do you make the best of being a doctor in that world and taking care of patients who are in an inadequate system. And in some ways, I think there's a lesson for everybody within that. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take a couple questions.
And while you're thinking of a question, we do have time for about one or two. I want to make an announcement. The university has made it possible to purchase and distribute a copy of this book to every one of the 270 second-year DO students. Raise your hands.
Man,
Okay,
that's a
so
big class.
as you walk out either side of the room, there will be a book available for you. Take one, please, and read it, and then pass it on. And if you'd like Dr. Tweedy to autograph it, to sign it, he will be available to do so, I think, downstairs in the
Right here?
in the lounge area downstairs after this lecture. Question or two, and then Dr. Hahn, I'll leave you the last
I think
word.
he's got a
okay?
question. Yes, sir?
Up here.
So you're like Oprah there. You got to run to the...
I wanted to give Dr. Rozelle the exercise, so... I have 1,000,001 questions for you, but out of due deference to everybody, I'll limit the number of questions I have. But you know, I personally get a lot of flack for always bringing politics into discussions of medicine and public health. But I think whenever you're talking about limited resources, as medicine and healthcare tend to be, they're inevitably going to be political discussions.
Sure.
So I find it almost naive to the point of ignorance that we are so quixotic and sometimes in medicine that we don't even discuss it and hold on to this belief that, you know, medicine shouldn't be political, but it is political because it controls who gets in to see us to begin with. So my question is, you know, how are you envisioning the future role of physicians, especially in a time where it looks like affirmative action goes to the Supreme Court every 3 or 4 years, but you know, it shouldn't even get to that point because that's such a downstream solution. It's like you know, a bottleneck, and you're trying to squeeze one or two things through. So I personally think it's a distraction.
From the larger problem.
Yeah, we could. Sure. There could be other legislation that could be helpful. So
sure,
those are just my 2 cents.
Yeah, so I mean, to your point, yeah, in some ways it is. It doesn't address the larger problem in many ways, for sure. I would agree with that. As far as the role of physicians, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I think you as individuals have to figure out what is your role. Each person has a different role to play. There's so many ways to attack the problem. So some physicians, there are people who will get into the policy realm directly. There are those who will do more of the public health research realm. There's so many. There's like no limit to the roles that you can play in addressing these problems. So it's really just a matter of what is it that drives you, what makes you wake up in the morning and want to do something. I mean, that's what I would say to people. I'm encouraged. I do think that younger physicians are actually more cognizant of those issues. Like when I was going through medical school, it was like, man, you're like, I'm just trying to get through and learn my physiology and pathology. I don't have time for any of this outside world stuff. And this is how it was. I mean, it's very different now. I'm actually encouraged to see more students, actually more, you know, as you say, more invested in these issues, because this is really, in so many ways, what's driving healthcare. I mean, it's like driving the health of patients is what's happening in the larger world. And there's more of an acknowledgement of that now, and there's more of and students seem to be more committed to talking about that. It was just something you could not talk about 20 years ago. So I think the seeds of change are actually happening. You know, so it'll be interesting to see what happens what it's going to look like 20 years from now. I think things are going in the right direction in that way.
Anyone else?
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to try to trip over these stairs.
Perchance, have you read the book or familiar with the book Just Medicine? Okay, so the idea behind that is that we've now technically moved past Jim Crow laws, but we have the new Jim Crow laws, of course, and that a lot of your question earlier as to what makes being Black a risk factor may relate strongly not only to cortisol and everything else that we know about, but to implicit bias, now that we've called out what explicit bias is and said that it's not allowable, so to speak. Do you think that it is necessary for laws to be enacted specifically to work on the sense of implicit bias and to help enforce more equal policies in that regard?
Wow, it's great. So you guys all heard the question. It's hard to say how much. I don't think law could ever totally solve that. I mean, there's certainly a role for that. I don't think and so I'm familiar with the book and the author. Yeah, I don't think they can totally stamp it. I mean, I think there's efforts being made to sort of, like again, when I was in school, these issues weren't even being discussed. It wasn't even on the table. So I think you can't ever make change until you begin to even discuss issues and acknowledge they even exist. When I was in school 20 years ago, this was not even, wasn't even on the table to have a conversation about it. So now it's much, you go to visit schools, it's much more open on the table, much more likely to have these kind of conversations. To me, in some ways, that's the first step, is sort of being able to even kind of talk about it in that way. There are some states that have gone further. Some states are making it that part of the requirement of licensure and renewal of licensure. There's sort of more tangible things that are trying to be done as well, but that's more of a state level issue that's happening somewhere at some places. But yeah, there's a role for it, but I don't think that alone by itself can't be the solution either. Yeah, it's so complicated. That can't, yeah. Yeah, the guy in the back there. Yeah, in the gray shirt, and I'll get you. I'm out of shape. I can't go that far. Sorry. I haven't played basketball in a long time. Right. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So I told the students I met with earlier that psychiatry was the last thing I thought I would do. I was actually told when I was going through my rotations that I should, during psychiatry, they told me I should be a pathologist because that's how bad I was at interviewing patients because I couldn't talk to people. So it was, never thought. But what ended up happening is I had a close friend. I ended up having a close friend who had a significant mental health problem in school, and it ended up causing him to drop out of school. And I had a couple other friends who had significant mental health problems. And it was my first taste of really seeing how mental illness could really take someone from one who had all the same goals and dreams in life that I had and take them in an entirely different direction by virtue of without totally out of their control. And it made me rethink the role of mental health. And I saw how much it was stigmatized within medicine. Like psychiatry is really stigmatized within medicine, particularly a place like Duke. And so, but you see how much patients suffered as a result of that. And along the way, I found that I was actually pretty good at talking to people. And so I thought there was a really important role that I could play. All that being said, I still started out in the traditional medicine route and started on the path towards cardiology before I finally went into psychiatry. But I think my next book will be about psychiatry and the role of how it's being stigmatized and how that impacts our healthcare system. That's sort of my next project. So thanks for that question. Yes, sir. I know you had a question.
And for all of those
Yeah, thanks so much.
who couldn't hear that on the live stream, what he's saying is that there's a startup for the SNMA, Student National Medical Association group on this campus, and anyone who's interested can contact your name? He'll send out an email. And Dr. D'Agostino is going to have the last question right here.
Well, put me on the spot. Quick question, it's probably going to be a very long answer. We know that the most influential intervention is one of socioeconomic status on health of a community. What can we do as individual physicians, in your mind, to start breaking down those barriers and actually influencing health the way we as physicians are supposed to be doing that?
Yeah, so socioeconomic status is undoubtedly huge. There are all sorts of ways. I mean, some of it is because there's real differences in the quality of care sometimes that is delivered as a result of that. And I think we as physicians have some ability to help mitigate that for sure, for certain. Then there's larger issues that you talk about socioeconomic status, whether it's like getting involved with, like you think about like, for instance, Duke, this idea of like health being about so much more than just the healthcare system. And what is the role of a school like this or Duke to the community? Like, what is the responsibility of a school that has lots of resources to a community that may not? And so I think in several ways we're trying to do initiatives that really engage with the community in a way that we really haven't in the past. We've only sort of played lip service to it. And so I think that's also a really important piece of really addressing, so using the resources that you have at a place like this to really help engage with the community to sort of mitigate those effects. Because there's no doubt that that's a huge impact in terms of health. So that's question one.
That was one.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll stop there. But thank you very
okay.
much, Dr. Damon Tweedy.
All right, thank you. Pleasure. Pleasure.
Great.
Thanks again.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Those of you on live stream, thank you very much for being here. This is wonderful. Our second-year students, please, as you're filing out, grab your book, and Dr. Tweedy will see you downstairs if you want to get it signed. Thank you very much.